In this lecture segment, we are talking about art in New York during the 1940s and 1950s. We'll focus mainly on paintings by abstract expressionists. One of the many consequences of World War II is that it brought European artists to New York City. We saw with the Armory Show in 1913 an influx of European modernism, and Mondrian was already working in New York, but in the 1940s new artists arrive as well, especially surrealists. We also have the voice of a powerful critic, Clement Greenberg, who advocates for a particular type of modernism, paintings that are flat, that in no way are trying to represent a particular subject, but instead are all about the formal elements. He believes in the purity of form and that modernism in this form needed to purge itself of everything that was not pure medium. He wants no content, no subject matter. The only content he wants is form. He advocates for formalism, for understanding and processing works of art only based on their visual elements. He privileges art for art's sake. For him, the works of art produced by abstract expressionists were the culmination of an evolution in modernism towards what was most pure and most what he wanted. Abstract Expressionism is an American avant-garde movement originating from New York, especially from the gallery scene of the city. It has two main divisions, action painting and color field painting, which we'll define. Some ABEX artists adopted surrealism as part of their practice, using chance and the subconscious to create works of art. Jackson Pollock is the poster child for action painting, applying paint through gesture, and is also called gestural abstraction. He was born in Wyoming, studied art in Los Angeles, and moved to New York and worked on WPA projects in the 1930s, one of the programs the government put in place to try and alleviate the poverty and unemployment of the Great Depression. He attracted the attention of Peggy Guggenheim, who owned a gallery in the city and showed his work. In 1947 or so, he began to make paintings by pouring and dripping paint, and this was a shock to the art world and helped to shift the home of the avant-garde to New York City, as Europe was rebuilding after World War II. Pollock had undergone psychoanalysis in the 1930s to deal with alcoholism, and felt that when he painted the collective unconscious, or the deep parts of a person's psyche that are held in common with all people, directed his creations, and those paintings in turn would touch the subconscious minds of viewers and give them understanding of the works of art he made. The technique Pollock developed involved putting the canvas on the floor and then walking around it and using brushes like sticks. He dripped painting onto the canvas as you see him doing here. The canvas was unprimed or not made firm for painting as it had been in the traditional oil paintings we studied. It was just fabric, and the paint was diluted so it could penetrate the canvas. And he often used not just oil paint but more industrial paints, including aluminum paint. As you see in this example, Autumn Rhythm, he produced a web of active lines that do not hide the hand of the artist. The gesture is really important here. We can tell where he went, where his hand moved, in creating this exuberant, dynamic network of black, brown, and white lines. We see drips of paint and flicks of paint in this detail, showing the paint around the edge of the stretcher bar, as the painting was put on stretcher bars, or the wooden frame traditional canvas paintings are affixed to. It was put on after it was painted, instead of before it was painted. In this detail, we see that some lines are heavy, some thin, some straight, some curved. They overlap and intertwine. There is no planned composition. There is no perspective. It is completely flat, and it is completely abstract. There is no other content except for paint on canvas, art that is about art. A viewer seeing this work was to see the product of Pollock's unconscious mind. Pollock was guided by his subconscious when he put the paint on the canvas, and to get this work of art, to understand it, the viewer needs to stop thinking about it, and instead let the color and movement of the work wash over them. Pollock stated, "One should not look for, but look passively, and try to receive what the painting has to offer." So Pollock was giving Greenberg what he wanted, art that is self-reflective. But there's also another way to think about this work of art, and that is approaching it as a document of an event. Critic Harold Rosenberg explains that what is shown on the canvas is not a picture but an event that documents an encounter between the artist and the material. The artist does not approach the work with an idea of what he was going to make. It is just about his action of doing something with the materials he had. Lee Krasner was raised in Brooklyn in a family of Russian Jewish immigrants. She trained as an art teacher, one of few paths available to women artists, and also worked for the WPA in the 1930s. Pollock worked on a project she ran. She begins painting in an all-over style, covering the surfaces of her canvases from edge to edge in abstract organic forms, working in abstraction in the 1930s and the 1940s, as in this example. Krasner marries Pollock and influences his way of working, especially with the all-over approach and the psychological bent of that work. In this example from 1957, Krasner combines her interest in organic forms with gestural brushstrokes in a huge work of art. Krasner was always up against the gendering of Ab X as male. This was a period of time in which the male hero, the soldier, the defender of democracy, think Captain America, was prized, and Ab X male artists were seen as art heroes. As a female artist, Krasner was excluded from the club, and her work was seen as too decorative, feminine, derivative, or weak. Color field painting, another division of Ab X, has artists not revealing or stressing the gesture of the artist in the creation of the work, but instead has artists filling up canvases with color. Mark Rothko was born in Russia, immigrates to the US, and ends up working as a WPA artist. He paints figural works and, like other artists we've talked about, is really interested in urban subjects. He works as a children's art teacher and then leaves all of that behind. He created works of art like this one that were intended to be emotional and spiritual, to connect with the viewer in a deep, resonant way. He slimmed down the forms in his paintings and instead began filling the canvas with color that soaked into the fabric, often 2 or 3 sections of color that bleed into the canvas and seem to hover, creating works of art that appear to glow. He became very frustrated that folks thought of his work as decorative, as corporate works of art suited for restaurants, hotels, and offices. He received a commission to paint a series of works for the Four Seasons restaurant at the Seagram building, and became disillusioned with the commission and creating works of art for wealthy folks to look at while eating, and returned the money after painting a couple dozen canvases. He felt that his work was about so much more, and said, "The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them, and if you, as you say, are moved only by their color relationships, then you miss the point entirely." So even though there is no content, no iconography, even though this is just paint on canvas, it does not pretend to be anything else, Rothko wanted the viewer to feel that the painting was not about nothing, that it had inherent emotional value and feeling, and that folks can understand it if they can leave history, memory, and myth behind. Again, an artist saying that the work is understandable if the viewer can get it, if the viewer can leave the world behind. Another artist who surfaced at about the same time as Ab X is Louise Nevelson, a Russian-born artist who immigrated to the US as a child. She took on the gender bias of Ab X by creating works of art that could not be accused of being feminine or decorative. Some scholars treat her as an abstract expressionist sculptor. She used found objects and ready-mades, think about the connection with Dada, and she dumpster dove for these in New York City trash piles. She used them to create big, built works of art like the one you see here called Sky Cathedral from 1958. It's a grouping of wooden boxes filled with smaller pieces of discarded wood. She takes components and transforms them into these aggressive, monumental works of art, and she paints these assemblages, these assemblings of objects, in one color, so they are monochromatic, usually black, to wipe out history, myth, to try and create the presence of the universe in one whole. She creates monumental works that takes the leftovers of life, wood scraps and crates, and compiles them together to produce an abstraction of the everyday. Then in removing these found objects from their purpose, she turns them into abstract forms. They also connect to the city, like built visions of the city's cast-offs, put together to make cityscapes in a way. So consider where we are at this point in the 1950s. We have works of art that are fully abstract, that are not intended to reference the natural world. They may have psychological and emotional content that the viewer provides, but they are about art being art, art for the sake of art, exercises in formalism in the visual elements of art. They may document the actions of an artist or be intended to help the viewer have a spiritual experience. They are not necessarily made of the media we've seen for centuries. They use house paint and trash to produce works of art for sale in galleries and shown in museums. And we see artists using media in unexpected ways. paint soaking into an unprimed canvas rather than being carefully applied to a prepared canvas. We see works of art revealing gestures on a huge scale. We are far along in our modernist trajectory, and the works of art we've been talking about in this lecture have many of the characteristics of modernism we first talked about with realism in the mid-19th century. But we've also arrived at another moment that relates to the viewer's engagement with a work of art. The relationship of a viewer to a work of art is a theme we've talked about since the start of this class. Remember Inanna and a ziggurat and votive statues and gazing and communicating. Remember Van Eyck and portraiture and expressions of identity and connecting with the viewer. And then in this lecture segment, we talk about artists who declare that the viewer's subconscious will provide them understanding of the work of art, like in Pollock, or that they will have a spiritual experience in front of the work if they can leave reality behind, like Rothko. What if the viewer does not get it? For many viewers, these works of art were alienating, perhaps because many lack subject matter from the natural world. So our next step in understanding the art of the 20th century is to explore the swing from Ab X back to the natural world, a shift we began to see with Louise Nevelson's dumpster diving for art materials.